Where I come from isn't all that great. My automobile is a piece of crap. My yellow skin is a little whack, and my man, I want to live a life like that. I want to live just like a king, you know? Take my picture by the pool because I have a big thing. Hey guys, welcome to Breaking Badger News. I am your host, as always, your friendly neighborhood Simpsons kin, Maximilian Darrett. And joining me for this particular edition of the show is the next big thing. He is the Doge in charge, Brian Martinez. Brian, it's interesting. You were, like, as soon as I told the entire staff that I was going to be talking about Playboy, you jumped on that like a fat kid on a Smartie.
Well, actually, I find that the magazine, it's actually a really great magazine. So I really wanted to see if I could make the case for it in defense of Playboy. So yeah, this interests me because, again, it's a matter of artistic freedom and freedom of expression and other things that I feel very strongly about.
Obviously, yeah. There's a lot of different,
and I totally read it for the articles.
Totally, the articles, quote unquote, that's what you want to call them. There's a lot of different intermingling aspects to this particular story. Obviously, we're talking, of course, about the creator of Playboy's death a few days ago, Mr. Hugh Hefner. He died at the age of 91, I believe. Did he die of a heart attack?
I think so. I don't remember.
He's an old dude, okay, I guess.
Yeah, he's very old.
And there's been a lot of articles popping up online sort of discussing his legacy and trying to point out all the good things and all the bad things and how we should remember him. Because to people like me, people who are young, didn't grow up with Playboy. I actually don't think I've ever read a Playboy in my life because I grew up in the age of the internet. Hello! But, when it comes to Hugh Hefner, all I think about when it comes to Playboy is he created it. I don't know much else about him. So reading a lot of these articles has been quite enlightening about what he did in terms of positive influence and in terms of negative influence. And I think, Brian, just based on what we were talking about prior to recording this episode, you're going to argue for more so the positive elements, which I will as well, but I think there's also some negative elements that are definitely worth bringing up.
Mm-hmm. Sure, absolutely. I mean, he is a man, and just like anybody else, he's complex, and it's not really straightforward.
Never is.
We should certainly look at those things. So yeah, but let's do it.
You go first, man. You're the one that wanted to talk about this so badly.
You wanted me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I just wanted to make sure. All right. Well, I guess what mostly I wanted to respond to there was a lot of, negative things said about him in the press when the body was still warm. And by the way, just to clarify, because I know people in the comments are going to do this anyway, but I want to get ahead of the ball. The cause of death was cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, sepsis, and he had E. coli. Jesus. So it was a combination of all those things. Yeah. But I mean, you just get to a certain age and there isn't much you can do about, the impending infections that will come and get you.
I'm surprised he lived to 91, but yeah, go on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Hugh Hefner started Playboy in part because, and I didn't know this. This is something, I mean, obviously there's like you wanted to make a magazine that's directed at men and basically, go in with the whole, let's do, what are men interested in? Well, women for one, right? So that was like the primary thing. But something I didn't know, at least not before I got this book. I have this book in front of me. It's sort of like a printed by Playboy, obviously, but it compiles a history of Playboy for at the time of its printing. It's 40 years of Playboy. I bought this in, I believe, it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and in it, in the beginning, which started in the 1950s, he had an interest in promoting jazz music and jazz culture. He was a huge fan of the genre, and he promoted acts like Satchmo, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, stuff like that. He also wanted to get a lot of other things that men were interested in. So it was like music, culture. There were women. There was also things like sort of the kind of stuff that Maxim magazine was doing when it first came out. You know, like what kind of drinks do men like? Well, here's how you can make them. Where are the places to go? What are some of the he printed artwork that was really beautiful, in his magazines. He had a focus on fiction. I don't know if you know this, but Ray Bradbury wrote little short stories in Playboy. John Collier wrote stories for Playboy. Ian Fleming brought James Bond to the West through Playboy by writing short stories about
Makes
him.
sense.
I think he started with For His Majesty's Secret Service was like the first thing he wrote for him. So there's a lot there. On top of that, he has done great interviews with lots of different personalities. This is the thing that I find interesting. I'm pretty sure that politically, Hugh was pretty progressive for the time. And you can see that by looking at the kinds of articles he printed. He was, a lot of, during Vietnam, there was a lot of anti-war stuff that he was, in favor of. He was definitely a pro-drug proponent, but the way that he had the articles written or the stuff that he looked at was, at least from what I can tell, it was an attempt to be as non-partisan as possible. I do think that back then our politics were not as partisan as they are today. But he would try to give you the pros and cons of, legalizing drugs. His personal feeling, from what I gleaned, was that he was an advocate for laissez-faire approaches, of essentially just let the market sort it out. He also gave interviews to people such as Princess Grace, Fidel Castro, Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Malcolm X, Janis Joplin, Raquel Welch, Joan Baez, who was she was a musician and also a civil rights advocate who actually is famous for singing the song We Shall Overcome, even though she didn't originally write it. But she's actually famous for singing it in Berkeley, California during the free speech sort of movement that was going on there at the time.
Oh, okay.
So, and actually that explains, this is something that my wife just brought up, that actually explains why Milo...
Yeah.
If you saw the live, they were singing that same song there. But Joan Baez was interviewed at that time, as well as Mae West, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Germaine Greer, who was a very well-known feminist, Bob Hope, Groucho Marx, John Belushi. There's tons of people. Jimmy Carter, and he would do people on all sides of the political spectrum. He gave them platforms. He wanted to hear what they had to say. He was giving jobs to women when it was sort of like when it wasn't. I would say when it was abnormal to do so. I wouldn't say that there was restrictions, but I think it was considered abnormal. Like, here's a fun fact. There was a woman named Bunny Yeager. Ironically, her name was Bunny. Nice. And there were the male photographers in the 1950s. So this is in the 50s. In the 50s, the models, many of them were shy around male photographers. So they didn't want to be photographed, or they were uncomfortable with it. So Hugh's solution was to hire a female photographer. So he hired Bunny Yeager, who was a woman that he used to essentially do the photo shoots with. But she also acted as a recruiter for other models. So she was able to get a lot of models on. She even modeled herself for some photo shoots. But some of the models she managed to get on were some that are really famous now. Betty Page, Jane Mansfield. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So there was I guess when you look at it that way, there's a lot there that is, I wouldn't say that this necessarily speaks to his character, but when you look at what the magazine did, and I think the thing that I'm most impressed by is we're looking at something that started in the 1950s and essentially continues to this day. But even back then, they were giving platforms, they were having discussions, they were essentially open to ideas that were coming from anywhere. And, and maybe he had his bias, sure, but he didn't let that stop him from, again, talking to people who are considered to be pretty conservative, like some of the ones I mentioned. Bob Hope, he's, talked to him. Clint Eastwood, I believe, what was some of the other ones? Oh, yeah, Groucho Marx, and John Wayne. So, as to name a few, So that's basically. I can go much further into it. I have the book right in front of me. But it was just there's a lot of beautiful artwork in it. He didn't think that there was any topic that was considered off the table. This was something that obviously had a market because he became filthy rich off of it. And
what, people like sex? No.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like, even though that's true, right?
It's not just that.
If you look at Playboy, though, it's not really. It doesn't really have sex in it per se. And the thing is, Hustler, in magazines like that, they did, or at least they alluded to it like heavily. They were way more porny. Playboy is pretty tame, and I'm sure that people are going to say that. It had nudes, and I wouldn't call it artistic. Like, I wouldn't go that far, but it certainly is more artistic than the stuff that's just the straight up like porno mags, that you could get at the time. So it was, and that makes me brings up an interesting question. Like, if Playboy isn't really porno, and by any stretch of the imagination, but it still existed. It was extremely popular. So that might say something about the market and the kinds of men that buy it. So just something to think about. There was a.
I was just going to encapsulate what you were saying. I think what the most positive thing to associate with Hugh Hefner when it comes to his publication of Playboy magazine is just how he was able to capture the attention of the American male and try to put forward a male identity that a lot of people can hook onto, where it was both, playing towards their primordial urges, but also offering something a little bit more sophisticated. And I think that at least sort of mimics Hugh Hefner's public persona, because when it comes to people that weren't necessarily intimate with him, like his girlfriends, everybody was just saying that he was the nicest guy, he was a true class act. Now, on the negative side, obviously when it comes to sort of obviously the more risque elements of his life, what you find out when you read some of the articles from his former girlfriends who left him after a while, you start to understand how regimented his life was, and whenever it came to anybody that he tried to have a personal relationship with, he could be a real jerk sometimes. Like, I got a quote, let's see. I missed it, but it's from a BuzzFeed article, and oddly enough, an article coming from BuzzFeed, it actually happened to not be that bad. It was from one of his former girlfriends. I think her name was Holly, and she was talking about how, she was suffering through depression, and Hugh Hefner wouldn't even let her leave the house to go see a therapist, and she had to go get antidepressants without much money, because most of the money that she was getting was either from her side job working at Hooters, or Hugh Hefner just paying her for being beautiful. Apparently he had this thing called like a beauty allowance, which is just, and there's other things beyond that too, which just made me really, it's sort of like awe-inspiring just to try to wrap your head around a guy as complicated as Hugh Hefner, but it's also kind of disgusting. And putting those two pieces together, it sort of just makes you sit back and you just sort of marvel at the person that Hugh Hefner was and the empire that he created. But it's also hard to determine, with all this information that's at hand, like whether to feel positively or feel negatively about his lasting legacy, because despite everything that you just said, Brian, which I think are ultimately positive things, getting women to sort of take more agency about the way that they choose to live their lives, offer more jobs, and his involvement with civil rights, gay rights, racial rights. Aside from that, the way that he was personally, and the way that he chose to live his life, and the way that affected his personality, sort of poisons the whole thing for me personally. But I don't know about you.
No, I understand that. I guess I can understand where you're coming from. And I would not, by any stretch of the imagination, consider him to be a saint or an angel. I don't agree with any of those things, that those things he's done in his personal life. I hope that stuff is true, because, we're going to have to go under that assumption. And I'm not saying I don't believe these women, there's probably some truth to it. Maybe, I don't know. But I guess what I'm trying to look at is, if there are going to be attacks on a person's character, they should be legitimate. They're allowed, but they should be legitimate attacks on their character, especially if you're going to do it in the public sphere. So if these women are saying something and there's truth to that, that's fine.
Right.
Well, I was more so responding to the people who are essentially making generally like you know that when he died, he had reserved a burial spot right next to Marilyn Monroe's spot. And, you know, there are people who are, I swear to God, there was a woman who said this, I think on Twitter or an article somewhere. She said, by doing that, he has essentially Marilyn Monroe is not going to be free in the afterlife because, you know, he's like right next to her and it's like rape or something. Like this crazy idea that because somebody got buried next to somebody else, it's oppressive. And, you know, that's what I'm saying. Like, there's legitimate criticism and then there's illegitimate criticism. Legitimate criticism I can get behind. I'm, you know, I'll be right there with you saying, yeah, that's, you know, it's messed up or whatever. But if it's illegitimate and you're just like trying to grandstand or gravestand, as the case may be in this particular instance, and you're not really saying anything of value, I got to call you out. And one of the things that I wanted to do is basically look at the stuff the magazine has done. So maybe this isn't as much about Hefner as it is about Playboy from you know where I'm coming from.
And it's hard not to do that because they're so interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, he's connected to it. It's his brand. It's like, you know, when Stan Lee worked for Marvel as the, you know, he was the face of it. So you associated Marvel Comics with Stan Lee. Ironically, we're talking about, I bring that up because Stan Lee as a cameo was Hugh Hefner.
Oh, yeah. That was a great
one
cameo,
time. So, yeah, it was. But yeah, I mean, there's, it is a great map. I'm still going through it, and I'm seeing more interviews with really interesting personalities. He talked to Dr. Ruth. He didn't. I mean, there was an interview done. You know, Gore Vidal, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Billy Crystal, Candice Bergen, Tom Hanks, Yasser Arafat, who I believe was, you know who that is?
He was the guy who popularized that scarf for. He was like a military guy. Yeah, I generally know who he is, but yeah, beyond that, not much. Same
yeah,
thing
I believe he was. Yeah, but I mean, like that. I gotta say, like in this current climate of people that are unwilling to give fair platforms to people that they disagree with, I would say that in light of that, the fact that Playboy would have on, you know, characters like Fidel Castro and characters like on the other side at the same time, despite their own opinions, it's incredibly depressing because this is like from years and years ago, and we haven't. It would appear that not only have we not moved forward, but we haven't even. You know, we've moved backwards in terms of that. So I guess that's where I'm coming at it from. I'm looking at the free speech angle.
No, of course. And that's sort of what we do here at Honey Badger Radio. Whenever it comes to free speech, that's ultimately what our number one goal is to preserve that. And seeing as Hugh Hefner definitely did have a part in that in the mid-1950s, allowing people to discuss this particularly taboo subject up until that point freely and without shame, that certainly had its positive effects, and it definitely had its negative effects throughout the years, but ultimately just being able to have that choice, being able to add to that freedom for Americans to be able to express themselves in that way and to talk about it openly, I think that ultimately is a good thing because it fosters the integrity of the individual, and that's what it did for men and for women. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know that there's so much here to talk about. I'm so much more fascinated about Hugh Hefner now just by doing my few minutes of research. Probably going to go watch some documentaries, or I'll watch the Jared Leto movie that's probably going to come out in a couple of years. He's going to be playing Hugh Hefner, by the way. So please leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below about any or all the topics that we discussed about today, whether Hugh Hefner, Playboy, yada, 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 or his girlfriends. Whether you agree or disagree, we'd love to hear what you have to say. Make sure you leave a like or a dislike, preferably a like. Just like it. Okay. And then if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe. We do tons of stuff here at Honey Badger Radio, including Breaking Badger episodes, which we do every single week. I want to thank Brian for doing this with me on such short notice, although, let's be honest, he was more than happy to do so about this particular topic. And until next time, have a lovely, lovely day.